The first time Nora saw Elias, he was sitting on the edge of a bridge, legs dangling dangerously over the side, a guitar resting on his knee. The melody he played wasn't familiar, but it was hauntingly beautiful, an aching sort of song that seemed to echo her own quiet heartbreak. She hadn't planned to stop, but something about the way he played, his head bowed as if he were praying, drew her in. "You're going to fall," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Elias glanced up, startled, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Maybe that's the point," he replied softly, though there was a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Nora hesitated, unsure whether to walk away or stay, but the vulnerability in his tone rooted her to the spot. She didn't know why, but she couldn't bear the thought of him being alone up there. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the spot beside him. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "It's your funeral if you're clumsy." She laughed lightly, though her chest tightened at the way his words carried an undercurrent of sorrow. As she climbed up and settled beside him, the song he'd been playing lingered in the air, unfinished. "Do you always serenade strangers from dangerous heights?" she teased, trying to fill the silence. Elias shrugged. "Do you always talk to reckless musicians?" Touche. That night, their conversation flowed as naturally as the river beneath them. He told her about his music, how every song he wrote was for someone he had lost, his mother, his brother, and the fiancé who left him without saying goodbye. Nora felt her heart ache for him in a way that scared her. She wasn't supposed to get attached, not when her own life felt so fragile, so uncertain. And yet, in that moment, she couldn't imagine walking away from him. Neither of them knew it then, but their lives had already started unraveling in ways neither could control. Over the weeks that followed, Nora and Elias became an inseparable pair, drawn together by the unspoken fractures in their hearts. Their connection wasn't built on grand gestures or declarations, but on quiet moments. Sitting on the bridge at sunset, Elias strumming his guitar while Nora hummed along, sharing stories of their pasts, each secret peeling back a layer of armor they didn't even realize they wore. Elias was like fire, bright, untamed, unpredictable. Nora, on the other hand, was water, steady, reflective, and always on the verge of slipping away. Together they created something fragile yet beautiful, a precarious balance that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "I'm not sure how to let someone stay," Elias admitted one evening, his voice low as they lay on the rooftop of her apartment building, staring up at the stars. "Everyone I've ever loved has left. It's like I don't know how to stop it from happening." Nora turned to him, her chest tightening at the vulnerability in his eyes. "Sometimes it's not about stopping it. Sometimes it's about trusting that the people who matter won't leave, even when it gets hard." Elias's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of doubt that refused to leave. "What about you? What are you afraid of?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the fraying hem of her sweater. "I'm afraid I'll hurt someone by staying." His brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" Nora wanted to tell him. She wanted to explain the reason she always felt like she was running out of time, why she avoided making promises she couldn't keep. But the words caught in her throat. How could she tell him about the illness that shadowed every decision she made? How could she ask him to love her, knowing she might not have much time left? Instead, she whispered, "It means I don't want to ruin something good by holding on too tightly." Elias didn't press her. He just reached out, lacing his fingers with hers. For a while it was enough. But as their love deepened, the weight of their unspoken fears grew heavier, threatening to pull them apart. The cracks began to show in the smallest of ways. It started with Elias pulling away when his music didn't feel quite right, the frustration of a verse that wouldn't land, turning into sleepless nights spent scribbling lyrics in notebooks. He'd grow quiet, retreating into himself. Nora would watch him, aching to help, but unsure how to break through the wall he was building. And then there were the moments when Nora disappeared, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. She'd cancel plans last minute, blaming work or exhaustion, though the truth was far more complicated. On the days when her body betrayed her, when the pain became too much, she couldn't bear the thought of Elias seeing her like that. She wanted to protect him from the reality of her illness, even if it meant keeping him at a distance. I feel like you're slipping away, Elias said one night, his voice raw with frustration. They were standing in her kitchen, the tension between them heavy, almost unbearable. I'm not, Nora replied, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. I need space sometimes. That doesn't mean I don't care about you. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. It's not space, Nora. It's walls. You don't let me in. And He stopped, his voice catching. I don't know how to love someone who keeps shutting me out. Her chest tightened. Elias, it's not about you. I'm trying. Are you? He interrupted, his eyes burning with hurt. Because it feels like I'm the only one fighting to make this work. The words stung, but she didn't know how to respond. How could she explain that every time she let him in, she felt like she was stealing something from him? Time, hope, a future he deserved. I need you to trust me, he said softly, his voice breaking. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you're afraid of, let me carry it with you. Don't shut me out. But she stayed silent, her fears chaining her to the ground. And in that silence, something between them began to unravel. Something neither of them knew how to fix. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into something neither of them could name. They still spent time together, still shared moments of laughter and quiet tenderness. But the tension lingered, like a thread pulled too tight, threatening to snap. Elias threw himself into his music, with a fervour that bordered on desperation. He wrote songs about love, loss, and longing. But he didn't share them with Nora. She noticed the way he'd tuck his notebook away when she entered the room, how his melodies grew darker, more restless. He was building his own walls now, and for the first time, Nora felt what it was like to be on the other side. One evening, as they sat on the bridge where they'd first met, Elias finally broke the silence. Do you ever feel like we're just waiting for something to break us? Nora flinched at the question, her heart pounding. She stared out at the water, unable to meet his eyes. Why would you say that? Because I feel it, Nora, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. There's something you're not telling me, and it's like we're both pretending that if we don't talk about it, it won't hurt us. But it's already hurting us. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought about telling him everything. About the hospital visits, the treatments, the doctors who spoke in terms she wished she didn't understand. But the words wouldn't come. How could she ask him to love her through something she wasn't sure she could survive? I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing river. I want the truth, he said, his tone sharper now. I want to know why you keep pushing me away when all I've ever done is try to love you. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned to face him. Because I'm scared, Elias. I'm scared that if I let you in, I'll ruin you, that you'll end up hating me for needing more than I can give. For the first time he looked at her, not with anger, with heartbreak. Nora, you already have all of me. Don't you see that? But the question hung in the air, unanswered, as she looked away, unable to face the truth of what her silence might cost. Elias didn't call the next day, or the day after that. Nora told herself it was for the best, that maybe they both needed space to untangle the knots they'd tied themselves into. But the ache in her chest didn't ease, it only deepened. She missed his laugh, the way he hummed absent-mindedly when he thought no one was listening, the way his presence made the world feel less terrifying. She wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but the fear held her back. What could she say that wouldn't make things worse? Every message she drafted felt hollow, every excuse a flimsy shield against the truth she was too afraid to admit. Weeks passed, and the silence between them grew deafening. She buried herself in work, in routines that numbed her, but nothing filled the void he'd left behind. It wasn't until a mutual friend mentioned Elias was playing a set at a small cafe that she found herself standing outside the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't planned to go, had told herself over and over to let him go, but her feet had carried her there anyway, as if some part of her still believed she could fix what had broken between them. Inside, the room was dimly lit, intimate, and crowded with people who leaned in to catch every note of Elias's voice. When she saw him on stage, her breath caught. He looked the same but different, his hair messier, his shoulders tense. And then he began to play. The melody was hauntingly familiar, and it took her a moment to realise it was the song he'd been playing the night they met. But this time there were words that struck her like a blow to the chest. It was their story, laid bare in every verse. The way he'd fallen for her, the walls she'd built, the way he felt like he was reaching for something always just out of his grasp. His voice cracked on the final line. I would have stayed, even if it broke me. Tears streamed down her face before she could stop them. As the room erupted into applause, Elias's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw the pain she'd caused reflected back at her. The applause faded into the background as they locked eyes. For a moment, the crowded cafe, the noise, the music, all of it melted away. It was just Nora and Elias, tethered by a string that felt as fragile as it was unbreakable. Elias stepped off the small stage, his guitar slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Nora stayed frozen in place, unsure whether to approach or leave before he could say anything. But then he walked toward her, weaving through the crowd until he was standing just a few feet away. You came, he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't know if I should, she admitted, clutching her coat like a lifeline, but I had to hear you play. His gaze softened, but there was a weariness behind it she hadn't seen before. You heard the song, then? She nodded, swallowing hard. I did. Elias waited, as if giving her space to say more, but when she didn't, he let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. Nora, I poured everything into that song. I told myself it'd be enough to let you go, to get it all out, but seeing you here... He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know what to do with this, with us. Her chest tightened. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I was protecting you by keeping my distance, but all I did was push you away. And now I don't know how to fix it. Elias studied her for a long moment, his jaw tight. I don't need you to fix it, Nora. I need you to let me in. Whatever it is you're so afraid of, I can handle it. But I can't keep loving someone who doesn't trust me enough to try. The words struck her like a thunderclap, leaving her breathless. She knew he was right. She had been holding him at arm's length, clinging to her fear as if it could somehow shield them both from pain. Taking a shaky breath, she said, Elias, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. He didn't respond, but the way he looked at her, patient, expectant, raw, told her he was ready to hear whatever truth she'd been hiding. And for the first time, Nora felt ready to say it. Nora's hands trembled as she reached for Elias's. His fingers were warm, steady, and she clung to them like they were the only thing keeping her grounded. She took a deep breath, her chest heavy with the weight of the words she was about to release. I'm sick, Elias, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the cafe around them. I've been sick for a long time. His brow furrowed, but he didn't pull away. What do you mean? She closed her eyes, feeling the first tear slip down her cheek. I have lupus. It's complicated, but it's been getting worse. There are good days, but there are also bad ones. Days when I can barely get out of bed, when the pain is so overwhelming I can't think straight. And the treatments, they help, but they don't fix it. There's no cure, Elias. This is my reality. She opened her eyes to see his reaction, her heart pounding. His face was unreadable, but his grip on her hands tightened. That's why I've been pulling away, she continued, her voice breaking. I didn't want you to feel trapped. I didn't want to burden you with something that's never going to go away. I thought if I kept my distance, you'd eventually move on and find someone who could give you a future, someone who wasn't broken. Elias's jaw clenched, and for a moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was steady but laced with emotion. You think I'd leave because of this? Because you're sick? Nora couldn't meet his gaze. People leave, Elias. It's just what they do. I'm not people, he said firmly, his voice breaking through her doubt like a sudden burst of light. I'm me. And I'm standing right here telling you that I don't care how hard it gets or how many bad days there are. I love you, Nora. All of you. Even the parts you think are too messy or complicated. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him, her walls crumbling under the weight of his words. How can you be so sure? Because I already lost you once, he said, his voice raw, and I'm not making that mistake again. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nora allowed herself to believe him. She let herself hope. And as Elias pulled her into his arms, she realized that maybe love wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about choosing someone who would stand with you through it. The air outside the cafe was cold as they stepped into the quiet of the evening, but Nora felt warmer than she had in months. Elias's hand was still wrapped around hers, his grip firm, unyielding. It was the first time in weeks that she didn't feel like she was fighting her battles alone. They walked in silence for a while, the streets dimly lit by the glow of street lamps. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice softer now. "How long have you been dealing with this? I mean, really dealing with it?" She hesitated, looking up at the stars. "I was diagnosed 4 years ago. At first it was manageable, just a few flare-ups, nothing I couldn't handle. But over the past year, it's gotten worse. The treatments take a toll, and the bad days," she trailed off, her voice wavering, "they feel like they're swallowing me whole sometimes." Elias stopped walking and turned to face her. His eyes searched hers, a mix of pain and determination etched into his expression. "And you've been carrying this alone? All this time?" Nora nodded, her throat tight. "I didn't know how to ask for help, and I was scared, Elias. Scared of what it would mean for you, for us. I didn't want to hold you back." "You don't hold me back," he said firmly, his hands cupping her face. "You anchor me. You're the reason I keep going when everything else feels like it's falling apart. Don't you get that?" Her tears spilled over again, and she leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his palms against her cheeks. "I didn't want you to feel trapped." "I don't feel trapped," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I feel like I've finally found the person I'm meant to fight for." The words hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had convinced herself that love couldn't survive the weight of her illness, that it would always be easier to let people go. But Elias wasn't just anyone. He was the one who stayed, who saw her in all her brokenness and chose her anyway. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be chosen. The next morning, sunlight filtered through Nora's apartment windows as she stood in the kitchen making coffee. The room felt lighter than it had in weeks, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted. Elias was sitting at the small table, strumming his guitar absent-mindedly, humming a melody she didn't recognize. His presence felt natural, like he belonged there, and for the first time, Nora didn't try to push the thought away. "What's that you're playing?" she asked, pouring a cup of coffee and sliding it across the table to him. He caught it with one hand and gave her a small smile. "Just something I'm working on. It's different from what I usually write." Nora sat down across from him, cradling her mug. "Different how?" Elias set the guitar down, leaning forward on his elbows. "It's not about loss. It's about hope." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "It's about us." Her heart clenched at his words, the vulnerability in his voice. "You're writing a song about us?" "I am," he said softly. "Because no matter what, I want us to be something that lasts, something that doesn't fade even when things get hard." The words hung between them, heavy and meaningful. Nora didn't know how to respond. A part of her still worried about the future, about the inevitable challenges they would face. But another part, one she hadn't let herself trust in years, felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. Elias reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her skin. "I know this won't be easy, Nora. I know there will be days when you'll want to pull away again, when it'll feel like too much. But I need you to know I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of something unfamiliar, something she hadn't dared to believe in for so long. "I don't deserve you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, you do," he said, his tone steady, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. The days that followed were a delicate dance, a blend of hope and uncertainty. But there was something different now, a quiet resolve that neither Nora nor Elias could ignore. They were trying, together, and even though the road ahead was daunting, they were moving forward. Nora began to let Elias into the parts of her life she'd kept hidden for so long. She took him to one of her doctor's appointments, her stomach in knots the entire time, afraid of how he might react to the clinical realities of her condition. But Elias sat beside her in the sterile waiting room, holding her hand, cracking quiet jokes to make her smile. When the doctor explained her treatment plan, he asked thoughtful questions, his calm presence steadying her nerves. Later, as they walked out into the crisp winter air, she turned to him, her voice hesitant. "That was a lot. Are you okay?" Elias stopped and looked at her, his expression soft but resolute. "It was a lot. But I'm not going to run, Nora. I told you. I'm in this with you." His words settled over her like a blanket, warming her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Elias, in turn, shared pieces of himself he hadn't before. He played her unfinished songs, revealing the raw emotions he usually kept buried. He told her about the guilt he carried over his fiancée who had left, the way he'd always blamed himself for not being enough. But with Nora, he didn't feel like he had to be perfect. He just had to be present. Their relationship became a series of moments. Nora teaching Elias how to make her grandmother's favourite soup on a rare good day. Elias coaxing her to dance in the living room when a song he wrote for her played through the speakers. They weren't perfect, but they were real. One night, as they lay in bed, Nora rested her head against Elias's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Do you think we'll ever stop being scared?" she asked quietly. Elias kissed the top of her head. "Maybe, but even if we don't, I think we'll figure out how to be brave anyway." And for the first time, she believed him. Spring came quietly, softening the edges of the world with new beginnings. For Nora, the season felt like a reflection of her own life, tentative, blooming, but fragile. The bad days didn't vanish, but Elias had a way of making them bearable. He never tried to fix things or tell her to be positive. He was just there, steady as the sunrise, reminding her she didn't have to carry everything alone. One day, as they walked along the park path near her apartment, Elias carried his guitar slung over his shoulder. The trees were budding, their blossoms brushing against the cool breeze. Nora felt lighter than she had in months, though the heaviness of her illness still lingered in the background like a shadow. "Play something," she said suddenly, stopping under the shade of a cherry tree. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Here? In front of all these strangers?" She grinned, a spark of mischief flickering in her eyes. "You've performed in cafes and bars. What's a park compared to that?" He chuckled, unslinging the guitar and sitting on a bench. "Only for you." As the first chords rang out, Nora felt herself drawn into the melody. It wasn't one of his darker songs, nor was it one she'd heard before. This one was light, playful, and full of quiet joy. "What's this one called?" she asked, sitting beside him. Elias didn't stop playing, but he glanced at her with a soft smile. "It doesn't have a name yet. It's Us, I think. A work in progress." Her chest tightened, but not with fear this time, with something tender, something she could only describe as gratitude. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like you," he replied without hesitation, his voice low but steady. Nora looked away, her cheeks warm, but she couldn't hide her smile. For the first time in years, she felt like she was stepping into the light after being trapped in the shadows. And with Elias beside her, holding her hand and carrying his own share of their burden, she realized something. It wasn't about living without fear. It was about learning to love and live despite it. And in that moment, with his music filling the air and the promise of spring all around them, she dared to believe they could. As spring unfolded into summer, their lives began to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't without its challenges. Nora's illness remained unpredictable, and there were days when the weight of it pressed down on both of them. But for every difficult moment, there were quiet victories. Mornings spent laughing over burnt pancakes, late nights on the couch sharing stories, and stolen kisses under the stars. Elias poured his heart into his music, and Nora became his muse in ways she never expected. He started playing more gigs, his songs shifting from raw heartbreak to something softer, more hopeful. His new material resonated with audiences in ways that surprised even him. One night, after a particularly packed performance, he found Nora waiting for him outside the venue. She was leaning against the brick wall, her arms crossed, a proud smile lighting up her face. "You were incredible," she said as he approached, his guitar case slung over his back. "You say that every time," he teased, pulling her into a hug. Because it's true every time. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. They love you, Elias. You're reaching people in a way that's so real. He kissed the top of her head. That's because of you, you know. She pulled back to look at him, her brow furrowing. Me? Elias nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You taught me how to be vulnerable, how to stop running from the hard things and let them shape me. Every song I write now, it's because of you. Because of us. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling up at him. You're going to make me cry in the middle of the street. He laughed, tilting her chin up to kiss her softly. Then let them see, Nora. Let them see everything. In that moment, standing under the glow of the city lights, she felt a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. She realised that love wasn't about perfection or guarantees. It was about showing up, about choosing each other every single day. And with Elias, she knew she would keep choosing him, no matter what. But life, as always, had its way of testing even the strongest bonds. One sweltering afternoon in late July, Nora woke up feeling worse than she had in months. The sunlight streaming through the window was harsh, her body aching as though weighed down by invisible chains. She tried to sit up, but the world tilted and a wave of nausea hit her so hard that she collapsed back onto the bed. Elias, who had been in the kitchen making coffee, rushed in when he heard her soft groan. His face paled when he saw her, sweat glistening on her forehead, her lips trembling as she fought to breathe steadily. Nora, he said, his voice urgent but calm as he knelt beside her. Hey, talk to me. What's wrong? She shook her head weakly, her words barely audible. Just a bad day. This isn't just a bad day, Elias said, his worry spilling over. He gently touched her forehead. You're burning up? We're going to the hospital. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. I just need rest. It'll pass. Nora? His voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. I know you're scared, but you don't have to do this alone. Let me help you. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded, too tired to argue. The hospital was a blur of cold rooms and hurried voices. Elias stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand even when the doctors drew blood, even when the beeping monitors made his heart race with fear. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor explained it was a severe flare-up, exacerbated by the summer heat and her body's exhaustion. They stabilised her, but the warning was clear. She needed to take better care of herself and accept more help. As they drove home, the weight of the day pressed down on both of them. Nora stared out the window, tears silently streaming down her face. Elias pulled the car over abruptly and turned to her. Nora, he said, his voice breaking, you can't keep shutting me out when things get hard. I need you to promise me something. She looked at him, her heart aching at the pain in his eyes. What? Promise me you'll let me fight this with you. No more running, no more trying to protect me. Just let me stay. And for the first time, Nora whispered the words that scared her the most. I promise. The days after Nora's hospital visit were different. They weren't easier exactly. Her illness still lingered, a constant undercurrent. But there was a shift between them, an unspoken understanding that made the hard moments feel a little less unbearable. She let Elias in more than she ever had before. Elias, true to his word, became her fiercest advocate. He researched everything he could about lupus, from treatment plans to lifestyle changes that might make her feel better. He showed up at her appointments with a notebook, asking questions she hadn't thought to ask, determined to understand every facet of her condition. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nora sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs. She watched Elias in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a focus so intense it made her smile. He had taken it upon himself to learn how to cook meals that were gentle on her body, anti-inflammatory recipes he'd found online. You don't have to do all of this, she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned, the knife still in his hand. Do what? Take care of me like this. I don't want you to feel like you have to. Elias set the knife down and walked over to her, crouching so they were at eye level. Nora, I don't do this because I have to. I do it because I want to, because I love you. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. But what if? He stopped her, taking her hand in his. There are no what ifs, Nora. I know the risks. I know the bad days will come. And I'm still here. I'll always be here. Her chest tightened, the walls she'd spent years building finally crumbling for good. For so long she'd been afraid to trust anyone with the weight of her illness, convinced it would scare them away. But Elias had stayed, not because he didn't see the cracks in her, but because he did, and he loved her anyway. That night, as they sat together on the couch, sharing a quiet meal, Nora realised something she hadn't dared to believe before. Maybe she didn't have to face the darkness alone. Maybe, with Elias by her side, she could finally learn to let the light in. By the time autumn rolled around, their life together had become something steady, something real. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, moments of frustration, and the ever-present uncertainty that loomed over Nora's health. But it was theirs. And for the first time in her life, Nora felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was living. One crisp October morning, Elias insisted they take a drive out of the city to see the leaves changing. He'd packed a picnic, complete with a thermos of hot cider and the soft blanket Nora loved. She teased him for being overly romantic, but she secretly adored the way he thought of everything. As they wound through the countryside, the trees were ablaze with colour, shades of amber and crimson that stretched for miles. Nora leaned her head against the window, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're quiet," Elias said, glancing at her. "Penny for your thoughts?" She turned to him, her smile soft but wistful. "I was just thinking about how different everything feels now. A year ago, I never would have imagined this. Us, this life." Elias reached over, taking her hand as he kept his other on the wheel. "It's funny, isn't it? How the things you don't plan for end up being the most important." Her chest tightened at his words, the truth of them sinking in. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'm glad you stayed that night, on the bridge. I don't think I ever told you how much it meant to me." "You didn't have to," he said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I knew." They arrived at a quiet clearing overlooking a small lake, the water shimmering in the sunlight. Elias spread out the blanket, and they sat together, eating and laughing as the cool breeze danced around them. At one point, Elias pulled out his guitar, strumming a soft melody that made Nora's heart swell. "What's this one called?" she asked. "It doesn't have a name yet," he said, looking at her with that familiar intensity that always made her feel seen. "But I think I'll call it Forever." And as he played, Nora realised she wasn't afraid anymore, not of the future, not of the bad days, not of letting someone love her. Because with Elias, she finally understood that love wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing each other every single day. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping the world in a blanket of frost and stillness. Nora and Elias had found their rhythm, a life that wasn't perfect, but was undeniably theirs. They celebrated the little victories. Days when Nora felt strong enough to take long walks in the snow, or when Elias finished a song he'd been struggling with. But winter also brought challenges. The cold often triggered painful flare-ups for Nora, and the shorter days seemed to magnify her fears. She tried to keep her worries to herself, but Elias always noticed when something was wrong. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in her apartment, Nora leaned against him, her body heavy with exhaustion. Elias had spent the day fussing over her, making tea, wrapping her in blankets, sitting by her side with his guitar. She loved him for it, but a pang of guilt gnawed. "Elias," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. He looked down at her, his hand idly stroking her hair. "Do you ever regret this?" "Us?" Her voice trembled, her question heavy with unspoken fears. He froze for a moment, his hand stilling, before tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. His brown eyes were steady, filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Nora, don't ever think that," he said firmly. "Not for a second. You are the best thing that's ever happened to me." "But I feel like I'm holding you back," she admitted, her voice cracking. "You should be out there, playing bigger shows, living your life, not stuck taking care of me." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "You don't get it, do you? You are my life, Nora. Everything I do, every song I write, it's for you. Being with you isn't a burden, it's a privilege." Tears filled her eyes, spilling over as she clung to him. "I don't deserve you," Elias kissed her gently, his lips brushing hers like a promise. "Yes, you do, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you if I have to." In that moment, as the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside, Nora let herself believe it. She wasn't just loved, she was cherished completely and unconditionally, and for once, she let herself dream of a future where love, not fear, led the way. The days began to blur as winter deepened, but their love only grew stronger in its quiet, unshakable way. Nora and Elias faced each challenge together, weathering the storms with a kind of resilience that could only come from two people who refused to give up on each other. By February, the snow began to thaw, and with it came a sense of renewal. Nora found herself looking forward to the small things, sunlight spilling through the curtains in the morning, Elias humming in the kitchen as he made breakfast, the way he always reached for her hand, even during the simplest of moments. But she also felt the weight of something unfinished between them. She'd always held on to her fears, her uncertainty about the future. But now, with Elias by her side, she realized she didn't want to let those fears define her anymore. One evening, as they sat on the couch, their legs tangled together under a blanket, Nora turned to him. He was focused on his notebook, scribbling lyrics in his looping handwriting. She watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Elias," she said softly, drawing his attention. He looked up, his eyes warm. "Yeah?" "I want to ask you something." He closed the notebook, giving her his full attention. "Anything." She hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of the blanket. "Do you ever think about the future? About what it could look like for us?" A slow smile spread across his face, and he reached for her hand. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "What do you see when you think about it?" She swallowed, the words catching in her throat. But then she pushed past her fear, letting herself dream aloud for the first time. "I see us, together. I see you playing your music, and me, maybe finding a way to help others like me. I see a life where we keep choosing each other, no matter what." Elias's smile grew, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "That's all I want, Nora. Just us, for as long as we have." For the first time, Nora didn't feel the weight of uncertainty. She felt hope, fragile but real, and it was enough to make her believe that their future could be everything they imagined and more. Spring arrived with the kind of warmth that promised new beginnings. The world around them seemed to awaken, just as Nora and Elias found themselves stepping into a chapter of their lives that felt lighter, brighter, and full of possibility. Nora had started volunteering at a local support group for people living with chronic illnesses. It was something she'd been hesitant about at first, sharing her story so openly, but Elias had encouraged her, reminding her how much strength she carried, even if she didn't always see it. "You have a way of making people feel less alone," he had told her one morning as they sat on the porch, sipping coffee. "You did that for me. Now it's time to let others see that too." He was right, of course, and as Nora began to open up, she found that helping others gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was missing. Elias, meanwhile, was thriving. His music had taken off in ways neither of them had expected, with his heartfelt songs resonating with more and more people. He started playing bigger venues, and though he sometimes worried about being away from Nora, she was the first to reassure him. "I'll always be here when you come home," she'd say, kissing him before he left for another show. "Go out there and make them feel what you make me feel." And he did. One warm April evening, after a small backyard performance he'd set up just for friends and neighbours, Elias surprised her. As the last note of his song faded into the air, he put his guitar down and pulled her up in front of everyone. "Nora," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you are the reason I believe in love, in hope, in everything good in this world. You've given me a life I never thought I'd have, and I want to spend the rest of mine giving that back to you." He dropped to one knee, holding out a simple, elegant ring. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, Elias! 1,000 times yes." Their friends erupted into cheers as Elias stood, wrapping her in his arms. Under the soft glow of string lights, Nora realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just living, she was thriving. And with Elias, she knew she always would. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the same clearing where Elias had played for her under the cherry blossoms. The spring air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the soft hum of nature, and the quiet laughter of their closest friends and family. It was perfect, not because it was extravagant, but because it was them, simple, heartfelt, and full of love. Elias stood at the altar, his guitar slung behind him as he waited for Nora. When she appeared, walking down the aisle in a flowing dress that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, his breath caught. She was radiant, her smile so genuine it made his chest ache. When she reached him, her hand trembling slightly in his, they both laughed softly, their shared nerves melting into the warmth of the moment. The officiant began the ceremony, but it wasn't until Elias pulled his guitar forward that the tears really started. "I've been working on this song since the day I met you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's called Forever." The melody was soft and sweet, a promise wrapped in every chord and lyric. Nora's tears flowed freely as he sang, and by the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the clearing. When they exchanged vows, they didn't just promise to love each other in the good times. They promised to fight through the hard days, to laugh even when life felt heavy, and to never let fear or uncertainty rob them of their joy. The rest of the day was a celebration of everything they'd overcome. They danced under the stars, surrounded by the people who had supported them through it all. And as they swayed to the sound of their favourite song, Elias leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for letting me stay." Nora looked up at him, her heart full. "Thank you for never giving up on me." And as they held each other, the world around them fading into the background, Nora finally understood. Love wasn't about perfection or guarantees. It was about showing up day after day and choosing each other. And she would keep choosing Elias forever.